I'm Nicolas Vien. I'm the head of Standard Innovation of Bonsucro, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today for this webinar. I'm going to start with some housekeeping rules to set and to organize this webinar. So the session will be recorded. You might have seen a button or a pop-up window when you join in, just to let you know. The recording and the slides will be then published on our website, so you can listen to it again or invite colleagues to connect to the Bonsucro website and listen to the webinar if they haven't been able to attend today. We will take as many questions as you want to ask, and for that we will ask you to use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen, or sometimes at the top. It depends on the configuration of your Zoom. You will see Q&A, so click on it, write your questions, and we will address the question at the end of the presentation, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible in the time we have today. So please don't hesitate to write them as the flow of the presentation goes. We won't have simultaneous translation on these webinars, but we'll run 2 webinars tomorrow and the day after in Portuguese and Spanish with simultaneous translation. So if you want to invite as well other colleagues to join who don't speak English, they will be able to follow the webinars on the following day. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, as well as the panelists and fellows participants to this webinar. I'm pleased to have with us Bill Aldenis, Associate Director at ProForest, who has been supporting us in this process of the update of the standard revision. Olivia Scholz, Marianne Lips, and Peter Alsop as working group members. So I'm very pleased and thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's great. I'm sure we'll have an interesting conversation. And to formally open, I would like to invite Peter to say a few words to us.
Thank you, Nicholas, and welcome to everybody. On behalf of the board of Bonsucro and the Technical Advisory Board and the working group, I welcome you to this webinar. The standards are obviously a very important part of what Bonsucro does, and we're very obviously aware that some of the standards need updating, and that's been the catalyst for this whole process. Many of you participated in the first round of public consultation, and certainly the working group were most appreciative of the comments that they got from that. I think you will find most, if not all, of those comments have been incorporated in the second round of public consultation. I'd certainly welcome questions on what the working group has come up with in the proposed standards. Please feel free to give those questions. They can only help us develop better standards into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. So this webinar will be divided in 4 sections. So we have at our opening remarks, then we will look at the overview participation of the previous consultation that took place a year ago. We will look through the phase 2 revision process, so you understand and see all the different work streams that were done during that second phase. And then we will go through the cross-cutting comments that we received during the first public consultation and how the working group has addressed them. So to put back in context of where we are now, the standard, Bonsucro standard, was first published in 2011 and has gone through regular phase of revision as per Code of Good Practice or standard setting. Every 5 years, we are owed to review and revise our standard. So we are now in fact, the second consultation of the second revision of the Bonsucro standards that has started 2 years ago with the first phase of first drafting when we had a public consultation last year. And from last year to now, there has been a work by the working group to take on board the comment received during the first publication, draft a second draft that we put forward today to the public for receiving comments. Those documents have all been published on the website last Friday, so they are accessible, as well as the summary of change and how the working group has addressed those changes, the draft guidance, which is attached to the standard, and the draft auditor guidance. There will be as well soon publication of the draft calculator. We are just finalizing it, but that will be as well published for you to look at. The public consultation ran for 1 month, so it opened yesterday and will be closing on the 13th of July. To present those changes, we are running a series of webinars. Today is the second webinar we have. We have 2 more going to happen tomorrow at 4 p.m. British time in Portuguese, and on the 17th, so in 2 days, at 3 p.m. British time for our mostly targeting our Latin American members and stakeholders. So we invite you to go to the website. We'll share the link so you can find all the documents relevant for this consultation, as well as link to the survey that we invite you to fill in. And now I will hand over to Bilge, who will explain you the process that has gone for the last 8 months. That was quite an intensive and very instructive process. Bilge.
Thank you, Nicolas, and thank you for inviting us to join today to moderate the panel. But first, a bit of information for you all who also participated in the first round of public consultation a year ago. You have the statistics for that one in front of you. And as someone who has run many public consultations for various standards, I can tell you this is very impressive. To get over 4,000 individual comments is a sign that the broader membership is really paying attention to this, and that there is a lot of stakeholder interest and buy-in. Of course, it's a production standard, so it's not surprising that the majority of the comments came from the producers. It's also not surprising that many come from Latin America, given the membership structure of Bonsucro and the big culture for public consultations in that region. It's of interest perhaps to see that almost half of the respondents were members of Bonsucro, and quite a few were certified participants. But that also means that even outside of the Bonsucro ecosystem, people are paying attention to this. More than half of the responses came from non-members. So that is also something to bear in mind, and also to be proud of in terms of engagement levels for the platform itself. Next slide, please, Noah. So to give you a bit of a sense of what has been happening, especially in the last 8 months, after the public consultation, with that volume of comments that came in, it took a while to analyze all that input and organize it in a way that the working group could then really work through it. And we'll show you a few images in a bit what that looked like. But to give you a sense what we tried to do, it's extremely difficult to replace what would have been a physical meeting normally, where the group would have been together for a number of days, exclusively focusing on the standard and on the comments that came in, by a series of remote video conferences. And I think particularly in this group today, you'll be aware that there is a tremendous geographic spread in the working group. So we have representatives from Australia and all the way over to the Americas. So that gives us a very short window in the middle of the day in Europe to have a couple of hours where we can get everyone together. So the strategy that was used then was, yes, of course, to have full working group meetings throughout that period, but to also do a lot of the work in smaller groups so that the members can maximize the time they can actually sit together and work through all the comments that came in. So all of that, of course, took its time, which means that now we are presenting the revised standard in the public consultation for a second time. And the target that the working group has set itself is to present the final standard to the Technical Advisory Board and Members' Council in September. So hopefully the sort of final stage will go fairly smoothly, and we'll manage to hold that date. Next slide, please. To put some concrete figures to all of that work in the last 8 months. So you can see the working group members have been very busy. There were a total of 16 calls between the full working group calls and the separate calls in the smaller subgroups. There were different rounds of, we called them homework often because it did feel a little bit like homework, where the group members could review proposals that were made by colleagues, comment on them, and remotely agree on some wording that's being put forward. So there were several rounds of those, and in total it meant that we ended up with over 30 iterations of the documents. Now this is also due to having split the standard into its principal subcomponents, if you like, so that the smaller groups could work more effectively, but it's still an incredible volume of work that went in. We also had a couple of sessions of really just pairs or 3 people of the working group looking at particular topics where they had to build consensus. Similar to what we've seen coming in the public consultation, also within the working group, of course, not everyone has the exact same opinion. So all of this work is needed to achieve a compromise and to build consensus on the various topics that are up for discussion. To give you an idea with some images, if you move to the next slide, please, Noel. This is what that looked like concretely. So in the top left, you see the report that was done following the first public consultation. There was a large Excel sheet where every single comment that came in was analyzed, its key points summarized and collated with those with similar view and those commenting on the same topic, but maybe with a different view. And that led to a very detailed report for the working group that you see in the top 2 images there, with some color guides for things where there was strong pushback or dissent from the public, others where more clarifications were asked for, etc. So we tried to present it as visually as we could to make the work of the working group as easy as possible. We then had several teleconferences, as I mentioned, and to get a flavor of what the review circles and comment phases looked like, you have that middle image. So the working group had many spreadsheets where proposals were put forward by them that colleagues could then comment on, and that led to building consensus in this sort of remote setup. Below you have an image of a working version of the draft standard. You see that the group also spent a lot of time working through guidance. So what's in blue in that little screenshot was the implementation guidance that is now placed in Annex 2 of the document. And there are live links from each indicator to its corresponding guidance and back. So it's a very interactive document that you have there. And in green, you see the draft auditor guidance that has now been integrated into a manual, a guidance document for the auditors. And that will also be tested now in the pilots that CBs are carrying out over the next few weeks, as well as in CB workshops. So that is also, of course, getting its due attention. And yeah, as I mentioned, we had a large number of focus, subgroup, and mini group calls to move all of this along as well. So yeah, I hope this gives you a bit of a flavor of all the tremendous work the working group has put in. And I think the membership of Bonsucro can be indeed very, very proud to have had such dedicated individuals in the group spending that time and effort to, yeah, present to you this draft we are now talking about in this public consultation.
Thank you very much, Bilge, for the overview of the process. That was indeed impressive and very interesting to follow with such a wealth of information and exchange across the working group members. And you've done a very good job in gathering all that, because that was quite a huge amount of information, yes, and discussions to capture and to synthesize into the draft standard and guidance. Before going into the detail of those changes that have happened and that we're presenting today, I wanted to take a little step back. As maybe some of you might know, we have now launched our new strategy 21-26, and you might have attended some of the webinars we presented over the last couple of weeks. So you will be able to find the detailed plan as well as summary of it on the Bonsucro website, and I invite all of you to, if you haven't yet, to go on the website, not only to look at the standard revision public consultation documents, but as well to look at the strategy plan for Bonsucro. So while the standard revision started before the strategy review, there are clear synergies and alignment between the strategy Bonsucro will pursue, a strategy that we call Changing for Good, and the content of the Bonsucro Production Standard the working group has reached consensus on. The 21-26 strategy built on many achievements to date, so it's kind of a continuity and an improvement towards the next step while reflecting on lessons learned. We have set out an agenda for change to deliver more value and make a bigger impact with the sustainable sugarcane. So we want to position ourselves and the sugarcane sector in the future, and that only is the Bonsucro being the only sugarcane sustainability initiative that combines all of the following characteristics: only focus on sugarcane, credibility of our standard setting process as we're seeing today, assurance and claims through the ICIL full membership, focus on continuous improvement, global reach with local presence, multi-stakeholder membership and governance, and as well a broader role as a platform for change beyond the membership. And those are being reinforced into the new strategy. With a dynamic and urgent global context, we are all called to make sufficient progress on the global goal for sustainability and climate change. So thankfully, despite the great disruption we all felt of COVID-19, the global drive for more sustainable supply chain continues across all key sectors, and definitively in the sector that interests in that we are working in with you in the food, drinks, fuel, and packaging sectors. Financing sustainable growth and the transition to decarbonized economy and a climate resilient economy will be an overarching theme for investors. Meeting at least the minimum safeguard on human rights and social standards will become increasingly important for the private sector. Environmental, social, and governance issues are now becoming core financial and legal compliance risks. The new, for example, the new EU Green Deal will have impact on supply chain way beyond the European borders. For this context, we derived the key input to our new strategy. We want to make sure we remain relevant and purposeful within the current and emerging global context, while delivering value to all our members and building an adaptable, resilient, and data-driven organization to meet the needs of the future. This strategy has been encapsulated into a graph on the wheel of strategy that you can see. It's a bit hard to look at, but I invite you to go on the Bonsucro website to see the detail of it, but it's a visualization of how the strategy will look like. So we have for each strategic aim, we have high-level objectives supported by targets and indicators. The new purpose of Bonsucro is clearly marked in the center. This is what we all focus on, to collectively accelerate the sustainable production and use of sugarcane. So this objective will be supported by priorities, activity, workstream and principles. The 5 strategic priorities are in light blue into the wheel and delivered through 6 activity workstreams that are in green and underpinned by 4 core principles that are in orange. So now that we have the context in which Bonsucro will operate over the next 5 years, we will present you how the working group has addressed the comments received during the first consultation when defining the second draft that we are publishing now. So the first overarching comments received was about the scope of implementation. Following the comment received on the first consultations, the working group recognized the challenge that certified operators might face when trying to reach out to independent farmers, especially if these farmers have not yet engaged on the sustainability journey. The working group recognized that every operator has access to different levels of resource and face different challenges. So using their experience, the working group identified the mechanism that takes these points into consideration to help producers moving forward toward the objective. The mechanism is called a time-bound progressive implementation plan. Producers are invited to create their own path and use their own timeline to reach out that goal. Rolling out the requirements of Bonsucro beyond the unit of certification might take 2 years, might take 10 years. Things go on the way, plans have to change. The purpose here is not so much on how fast the standard is rolled out beyond the unit of certification, but how operators plan for the future and how committed and self-compliant each operator is with their own plan. If we speak about auditing, the role of auditor is to verify that each operator complies with what they've committed to. The audit will not look at the whole supply area, and the expectation is not that there is compliance in the full supply area, but what actions operators can take to influence and encourage independent producers to make improvements. So for certified members, you might see this is a very similar approach to what's happened when a minor non-conformity is raised. When a minor non-conformity is raised, operators are required to develop and implement a plan which over time will result in the correction of the minor non-conformity. So the same principle has been adopted here to roll out some requirements beyond the unit of certification. The second overarching comment was about the economic implication for producers. So the working group wants operators to keep inside the endpoint and remain proactive in rolling out sustainability to the whole supply chain. Why? Because it makes sense, it's good for the business, it's good for the planet, it's good for the people. A sustainable supply chain benefits farmers, local communities, economy, workers, millers, and all the supply chain actors. But it is very clear that the working group does not want to add additional burden to an already pressured sector, which just recovered from the pandemic, COVID, and very low international sugar price. The time-bound plan presented just before, as well as the indicators as written into the draft standard, invite operators to work at their own pace according to their resources and their own priorities. And I always like to think of this good example that was developed in Brazil when they developed the program Renovação, which aimed at the rolling out green harvesting over the whole central south of Brazil. This plan was not done over time. It was not expected that within one day all producers would stop burning cane. It was a 10-year plan with intermediary targets. It turned out that operators achieved their own targets much earlier than expected, as new techniques, knowledge were created, and for producers has access to them to accelerate the transformation. So the working group believes the same might happen and will happen with the plan starting slow to reach big. The next overarching comment was about national context. So we know that ESG issues are moving beyond reputation and supply chain resilience risks to become very core financially legal compliance risks. So meeting at least the minimum safeguard on human rights and social standards are increasingly important for the sugarcane sector and the private sector. So the working group has grounded some indicator in international best practices and code of compliance like the ILO, WHO, UNGP, OECD. These practices might sometimes go beyond national legislation. This is something that is not new into the standard. If we look at in the current standard, we have the list of banned agrochemicals that goes beyond sometimes national legislation. This is because the objective is to really prevent the use of the most harmful agrochemicals, either for the health of the workers or for the environment. So for the new additions, the working group also listened to the comments and acknowledge that change might take time and resources, and have added transition time into the requirement to allow times for operators to adapt. Another comment was about the lack of guidance. When we did the first public consultation, what we published was only the standard, and a lot of comments were received about, yeah, but we need to have guidance on what exactly those standards means or how we're going to implement them. So as part of the second phase of development, the working group spent a lot of time on developing a comprehensive guidance document. The document draws from the expertise of the working group in their various fields of expertise, ranging across the 3 pillars of sustainability. So built as a how-to guide, the guidance provides rich content for the practitioners of the standard and aims at offering tips and suggestions when working toward compliance. The guidance is for information only, and compliance against the guidance is not part of the certification audit. It's a huge source of information, knowledge, and support to internal and external training programs, and is aimed to be used as such. The next comment, overarching topic, was about decent living wage. So a lot has been said and commented about the living wage. Living wage is an issue, it's a question, an improvement that is on the right. And we can't ignore that large components of value chain is now embracing the concept of living wage and supporting its implementation. We need to make it clear, though, that the working group does not expect living wage to be implemented in full immediately. The standard recognize that the working group recognize that implementing living wage takes time and effort. As such, the draft standard set a path for change that is structured in a stepwise manner. All living wage experts will advocate for this stepwise implementation to be successful. The indicator indicates that operators will reduce the gap, meaning the gap between current salaries and living wage, by 5% in the 3 first years and 10% over the following 3 years. And you won't make this journey alone. In its new strategy, Bonsucro has committed to play a role in gathering the supply chain actors around the topic of living wage, as we recognize that nobody should be left alone to address it. And this is the working group decided that this indicator will not be core, so it's a non-core indicator, meaning it won't affect the certification decision outright. The next one was working hours. So we all recognize that working in the sugarcane sector can be demanding and carried out in an unfriendly, unhealthy, and dangerous condition. International guidance are extensive on the need to manage maximum hours of work to safeguard the health and safety of workers and to ensure sustainability, long-term productivity. Various countries have tackled head-on the issue and successfully worked to reduce the total hours of work for the most dangerous work. Inspired by these successes and benefits that have emerged from this, the working group has included a limit of 60 hours per week. The working group has also heard the feedback from the stakeholders and agreed that it is necessary to allow a period from 3 to 5 years to roll out those indicators. This allows companies to prepare and adapt. And the working group recognized that there may be occasional occurrences in which some workers must work 60 hours. So this is permissible when exceptional, and the guidance set out framework on how to deal with those exceptional situations. The next comment was about HCV. The working group has reworked Principle 4 to make it more integrated and more explicit. So as such, Indicator 4.1.4 has now been split and integrated into Indicator 4.1.1 and 4.1.2, where it's seated more naturally. So the working group believes that maintaining and protecting vital biodiversity and ecosystem is essential for the future of the industry. And the working group also recognizes that currently vital information and resources are expensive to come by. The changes proposed, especially the guidance that is currently being developed by the HCV network, provide operators with locally adaptable know-how on how to map biodiversity and ecosystem services that are on or around the farm. We also introduce a risk-based approach to protecting and maintaining HCVs, meaning that conducting HCV assessment will only be necessary when most needed in high-risk areas, dramatically improving the blanket approach that currently is in the current standard. So with those overarching comments, I will now hand over back to Bill, who will explain the reorganization of the principle before then moving to a panel discussion. So I still invite everyone to put on your question in the Q&A chat. Especially we're happy to have Olivia with us from the HCV network. Olivia have to leave at the hour. So if you have questions specific for her, please don't hesitate to add them into the Q&A box now, so we can address them at the start of the panel discussion. Bigger.
Great, thank you, Nicolas. So before we move to the panel, there's just a couple more slides to do with the reorganization of Principle 1 and Principle 2. So as the working group was looking through all the comments, it was also quite clear that some of it, particularly pertaining to P1 and P2, was linked to the structure within each of those principles. So people felt that there's some repetition, or that something had already been spoken about in an earlier indicator, but slightly differently. And so the working group and those specific subgroups focusing on P1 and P2 took a lens at all of the indicators and basically structured them in a more logical flow. And you have the flow shown there at the bottom of the screen. So first off, the policies are, of course, what guide us. So that remained as criteria 1.1. Then the next logical thing is to think about the risk and impact assessments before we then design a system that addresses the identified risks and potential impacts. And that's criteria 1.3 there in the middle. And there, interestingly, several new aspects were added that were highlighted in the public consultation also as beneficial improvements, one being the development of standard operating procedures, and the other was to have an upfront indicator on the use of free, prior, and informed consent in a proactive way to allow companies to avoid what may come otherwise, as shown as the very last indicator in this principle, and that's to do with the grievances. So kind of be proactive first, have the systems in place, and then having to address any shortcomings only as the last resort, so to speak. So with that, 1.4 then became around monitoring and evaluations and grievances and complaints that may still come in. So with that, Principle 1 now has a very clear logical flow, and hopefully also some very useful tools to help producers be proactive about system implementation, to help with overall sustainability of their operations. On Principle 2 then, if we move to the next slide, it was a similar feeling with some repetition and sort of that there could be a better flow overall of the principles. So criteria 2.1 remained around health and safety, with some reordering that at the end, the last two indicators. Criteria 2.2 is all around worker contracts and pay and overtime and such. So all very sort of the practical pieces there for the workers. 2.3 is around the broader good working environment. So there variety of working conditions related indicators were grouped. And then 2.4 is used to talk specifically about the employer-employee relations around trade unions, collective bargaining, but also social dialogue, and again, a specific grievance mechanism also for the workers when all of that has not worked as well as we would have hoped. So with that, the working group hopes that those two principles are now much more logically organized with, again, a lot of practical indications supported by solid guidance to help the producers work towards the sustainability goals there. With that, I would like us to now move to the panel discussion. And as mentioned, we're very happy to get your questions. You have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there. So please do type your questions in there. And as you've all heard, Olivia's only with us for another 20 minutes or so now. So let's take full advantage and start off with some questions we already have concerning HCVs. So Olivia, one thing that came in very strongly from the first round of public consultation was, of course, that people associate full HCV assessments with high costs. Maybe you can tell us a little bit what the thinking is now within the working group. How could that be addressed so that that isn't the case?
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this webinar and explain a bit more on how we've taken feedback during the first public consultation and revised and elaborated on the indicators and the guidance. So just starting with high conservation values, these are critical environmental and social values that we all agree should be protected. Examples include the rights and basic needs of local communities or rare, threatened and endangered species as an example. So in cane production landscapes, typically these are quite modified landscapes already. So in many cases, high conservation values will not be present or impacted. However, with regards to the standard, it's still really important to have safeguards in place for where they do occur in production landscapes that in order to align with international best practice, supply chain commitments, as well as investment policies. So as a result of the feedback from the first consultation, we did go revisit these indicators. Nicola just showed on one of the earlier slides how these were reorganized to make them more logical and practical. And it's a case, the guidance that's been developed to support achieving these indicators are very much tailored to the risk levels associated with cane production, as well as the role of the mill in having a supply-based perspective. And it's also very much about understanding that growers need to be able to take ownership and understand the biodiversity on and around their farm in order to develop and implement those biodiversity and ecosystem services management plans. So as an example, the indicator 4.1.2 is about growers developing these management plans, and the maintenance of HCVs in ongoing production is integrated into that process. So growers will be able to use the guidance that's being developed to identify if there are indicators of HCVs on or around their farms and implement additional measures, but that will not need expert support in order for them to be able to do that. The risk on HCVs is more significant when there is expansion of cane production. So that is the rationale behind 4.1.4, is having a risk-based assessment questionnaire that growers use in advance of conducting the expansion. And they can use that questionnaire to identify if there is elevated or high risk of their planned expansion on high conservation values. So there are a series of quite simple questions that growers can answer, and that will inform them if they're at low risk and therefore there's no extra requirements with regards to HCVs, or in rare cases, there may actually be a high risk. And in that instance, they would be required to commission a HCV assessment by an expert. So this is the rationale, make it a risk-based approach so that where there are situations of elevated risk, those safeguards are in place.
Great, thank you, Olivia. So it sounds like the working group is really trying to make it as easy as possible for the producers. And you mentioned questions, so that sounds like there is a template, in fact, that is being prepared. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, there'll be a template, yeah.
Great. We had another sort of short practical question. Is HCV a core indicator?
Good question. I think it's the 4.1.3 on past conversion. That's certainly a core indicator. And Nicola, maybe you have to remind me. I can't. The 4.1.4 and expansion is a core indicator as well.
Yes, so for the, sorry, I was confused. Yes, so 4.1.4 is a core indicator. So across the whole cane supply area, further expansions are conducted in non-HCV areas. So this one, and then we have as well as a core indicator, which is a carryover from the previous standard to map biodiversity ecosystem services and risk across the mean supply area, which is as well a core indicator, and is where we had included and split it from the previous 4.1.4, and 4.1.2, which is maintain and enhance biodiversity ecosystem, and HCV on and around the farm is a non-core indicators. So how to develop and implement the biodiversity ecosystem service management plan.
Great,
thanks.
Thank you. So that, yeah, Claire, so there's a number of indicators, in fact, and yeah, just take a look. I would encourage the person who sent in the question at the details. And as Olivia explained, the expectation is really that for the majority of cases, given the realities of sugarcane production and well-established sugarcane production areas, the expectation is that there really won't be many high-risk scenarios that would trigger a full HCV assessment, and to establish that, a template has been developed. We also had a question, Olivia, to do with how HCV is being followed in other standards. Maybe you can kind of describe how the approach that we're proposing here now for the Bonsucro standard differs from what is currently being done in other standards, and what its particular strengths and opportunities are.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So over 20 sustainability schemes have adopted the HCV approach. And, you know, over the years, the network is increasingly working with and supporting individual standard schemes in developing tailored guidance to support licensees to implement those requirements within the standard. So as an example, you know, conducting assessments by smallholder producers is beyond the means of smallholder producers themselves and the technical capacity. So that's led us to designing very much tailored risk-based approaches for each standard, which considers the specific risks associated with production under that standard, and also the licenses small, whether it's large scale. So this has led us to developing standard tailored processes. We've done this for a number of standards now, and we're doing the same process with Bonsucro. So essentially, if this goes, as Bill mentioned, you go through completing the risk assessment, and where there is high risk, then which is often in rare cases, then there is very clear guidance on how to conduct those HCB assessments in high risk contexts. So the process that we're going through with Bonsucro is very much following what we've been doing with other standards, building on those experiences of working with other standards, and developing very clear guidance for the users of who are expected to implement those requirements.
Great, thank you for that, Olivia. So yeah, great to see that this is now also becoming a very concrete piece in the Bonsucro standard as well. So yeah, alongside many other voluntary sustainability standards, we've already embraced the concept and are implementing it. So this is great. A linked question, because you had mentioned the templates. We also received a question more broadly, and maybe I can direct that one at Nahuel, around templates and guidance that will be made available, and in general the support that Bonsucro will make available for the implementation of the production standard.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Bilken, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. So in regards to support and templates offered by Bonsucro, the first is Bonsucro will, as soon as the standard is published, as part of its rollout plan, will take the lead on training both the certification body, the auditors who will be able to implement them, and also training the different support systems that go into training all the various different mills. That would be licensed trainers, it could be capacity builders, consultants, different organizations to do it. And in certain cases, we might be able to offer more direct training. With regards to templates and resources, apart from the ones we already talked about, HCV resources, these will be progressively according to the several years as we have more experience with the standard, as we realize more of the needs of the producers, more specific guidance might be, templates might be developed. But we feel that the guidance should provide at least the basis for the standard to be implemented by producers without significant need of external help. That's always been the objective of Bonsucro, for the producers to try as whenever possible to do all of the implement the standards by themselves. If there are certain areas that we can assist by providing different templates, something we're more than happy to look at that and develop them on a needs basis.
Great, thank you, Nahuel. And it's maybe a good opportunity to remind the attendees as well that now, of course, the implementation guidance is included in the standard document itself. It's shown as Annex 2. And the working group actually spent a lot of time elaborating the guidance, which was, a strong request coming in from the first round of public consultation. So a lot of the indicators should be a lot clearer now, thanks to all that work that went into developing the guidance. So I would encourage you all to take a look also at Annex 2 specifically to see the support through the guidance that Nahuel was just describing as well. Thank you. Maybe I would say it's time to also hear from one of the producers. So I'd like to call on Peter to tell us a little bit about his view as a producer member of the working group. You've of course been involved in the discussions to improve the standard, and maybe you can highlight a few to your fellow producer members that you consider particularly innovative and value adding for the membership.
Thanks, Bill. I think perhaps the most important one is criterion 4.2, which is about the management of soil. And I think if my Australian colleagues have a look at some of those indicators and the flow through those indicators, they'll see some very strong similarities to the 6 easy steps type approach that's used particularly in Queensland and is endorsed by the Queensland government. It certainly starts with understanding your soils by mapping, understanding what you've got, taking soil samples so you're sure of what your nutrition type status is, what your compaction type status is, developing some objectives then for improvement, both in nutrition, the physical characteristics and the biological characteristics through the health of the soil, making sure that areas with, for example, low organic matter, acidity, salinity, or sodicity are corrected, making sure that the appropriate ratio of fertiliser and amount of fertiliser is used as recommended by soil analysis, understanding and controlling soil erosion and compaction, and particularly in lots of situations, and this is probably not an Australian type situation, but burning of sugarcane tops and leaves after harvest is prevented. You'll see some of those are core indicators, so the mapping is a core indicator, and the amount and ratio of fertiliser applied is a core indicator as being very important things in maintaining that soil and maintaining the health of the soil and the productivity of that soil. These are things that are very much in the focus of some of the end users. They understand that soils are one of the major basis, if you like, of sugarcane production, and the basis that's most likely to change with incorrect procedures. So very strong there on those soil management plans. Bill?
Yeah, that's great, Peter. Thank you. And I believe the working group went through extra lengths to also consult with some soil experts, particularly to make sure that all of that is reflected, right?
That's correct. There was a subgroup, if you like, of the working group with soil experts from a number of countries contributed to those standards. I think what you see there is very workable, and also very useful.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. And I believe, I mean, if we stay for a minute longer on the environmental aspects, it was similarly strengthened where the water management is concerned, and I believe also the integrated pest management. So actually all the environmental topics. I don't know if you want to just share about that as well.
Yeah, certainly all of the environmental things. So the water, the pests, the diseases, the weeds are all important parts in production and seen as important criteria from an end user point of view. Water is obviously one of the other really big input type thing that end users see. Identifying the main water resources is certainly seen as a core indicator. Mapping of the titles, so do you have actually the right to use that water? Promoting sustainable water use, obviously the best production you can get from the amount of water that you apply, and making sure also that the water, particularly that comes out of a mill, is of high quality. So dissolved oxygen at the effluent point is one of the major criteria there as well. So you certainly see that the core indicator is about identifying those resources and developing and implementing an action plan to contribute to that sustainability of that water resource. If we move on to the pests and disease and weed management plans, you'll see a very similar thing there as well. So a core indicator is about understanding what you've actually got in the way of pests, weeds and diseases, understanding when you should apply a treatment through, for example, a threshold, and understanding that you need to go out and monitor and understand what population that you've got. If you look at both the pests, the weeds, management plans, it's all about understanding and tailoring those plans to what you actually have in your system. There's no simple recipe for pest management, disease management, weed management in sugarcane, but it's understanding what you've got and the best way of running your farming system to minimize that economic impact of those things and to minimize any off-site impacts. There is a strong core indicator about how much agrochemicals you should apply per hectare per year, and that's there certainly to minimize air, soil and water contamination, particularly those off-site impacts. There's also a core indicator about banned agrochemicals applied. So banned agrochemicals are banned. There's a 0 kilograms of active ingredient per hectare per year there as the standard. And particularly, again, the end users really want to see those banned agrochemicals certainly not used in anything that's got Bonsucro sustainability.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. I hope that gives our audience a bit of a flavor of all the improvements that the working group made to the environmental requirements in particular. But let's switch over and talk a little bit about the social requirements. And we're pleased to have Marion here with us to support us on that particular topic. Marion, if you remember in the last public consultation, there were a lot of comments that we received on the living wage indicator particularly. And people, I think, due to the lack of guidance that we had when that first draft went out, got very scared as to potential cost implications, etc. So could you maybe talk us through a little bit how the working group picked that up and what is now being presented to the users in the next draft?
Yes, thank you, Bilge, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to clarify some of the social indicators in the new standards. Living wage, well, a lot can be said about living wage, of course. A lot was said about living wage. And it's clear that the working group already decided in the first round that it did deserve a very important place in this new standard, not only because it's a fundamental human right recognized by the ILO and the OECD, but also because it's clear that current minimum wages often don't cover the local costs of living. So living wage can be really be significant for workers to find their way out of poverty. And it's interrelated with a lot of other human rights, like child labor, workers who can meet the needs of themselves and the family and don't have to work excessive overtime hours, don't have to send their children up to the fields instead of going to school. So it's interrelated with a lot of other very important indicators. It was clear, although, that there was not enough guidance to really understand this indicator. And of course, it raised a lot of questions about the costs, about how to organize it. And we tried in the new guidance to be more clear about that. We did build in some more time to reach this indicator. It's like a stepwise approach also. So in the first 3 years, the gap can be defined between the actual wage paid and the living wage that is desired. So the gap can be defined, an action plan can be made together with other stakeholders, together with workers. And with that action plan, producers can work towards reaching a raise of the wage in the first 3 years for 5% and after that for 10% in each certifying period. And they don't have to do it alone. It's also anchored now in the strategy of Bonsucro. So Bonsucro can assist in making that effort. It is a new concept, of course. Well, we have to do this together. Yeah.
Great. Sounds like a lot of work went into that aspect as well, with yeah, a lot more guidance now available, as well as yeah, describing the support that will be available to producers, and kind of a very slow phase in to really be able to guide everyone through that.
That's it.
Peter, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to add to Marion's comments on that topic? No? No? Okay. So Marion, you mentioned human rights in your response as well, and you said that the living wages are part of yeah, showing compliance also with human rights. And we know that this is getting increasingly important for the end users, particularly who are based in various European countries and in North America, where more and more legislation is actually being developed that asks companies to demonstrate human rights due diligence. I know the German parliament just passed a sustainable supply chain law last Friday. So with that in mind, how do you think this new Bonsucro Production Standard can help producers demonstrate that they are meeting human rights requirements?
Yes, well, you're right, Bilge. It's very important at this moment, because the European Union, as well as a lot of member states, is developing mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And many laws are being accepted at this moment, yeah, as you told, in Germany. There is a law proposal in the Netherlands also. In France in 2017 already a proposal was adopted. So this human right due diligence, the mandatory aspect of it, is becoming increasingly important. And living wage, amongst other indicators, is expected to be one of the important elements. And I think this standard will be a great advance for producers to meet these new due diligence requirements. Due diligence on human rights and environmental aspects is actually about how to identify, to assess, how to prevent, to mitigate, and to account for how you address potential risks in a sector, in this case in the sugarcane sector. And the new standard is exactly structured and shaped to do this in a guided and structured way. So compliance with this standard is actually complying with core ILO conventions on minimum wage, on working hours, freedom of association, social dialogue, but also human rights like rights of indigenous people, health and safety, housing. So it's a very future-proof standard. And hopefully it can also serve in the future, but let's see how that will work, as a proxy for mandatory human rights due diligence laws. Yeah.
Sounds like the downstream actors should all be extremely happy about the new standard then.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's becoming more and more important, and not only in mandatory due diligence laws, but also we see a movement in the financial sector, for instance. And I can mention an example. In the Netherlands, there is this platform for living wage financials, which counts for 2.6 trillion euros of assets under management. So it's huge, has a lot of impact. And they are addressing the non-payment of a living wage in supply chains, in garment, but also in food and beverage. And they are targeting specific sectors. So it's very important that also this sector, sugarcane, is future-proof in that way. Yeah.
That's great. Before we move away from the sort of social topics, there was one term in the first draft of the public consultation that people also found a little confusing and asked for more guidance on it. That was the term of social dialogue. And I believe, again, it's an area where the working group has now put a bit more meat on the bone, so to speak. So maybe, Marion, you can just describe the background to social dialogue and how that is now captured in the standard.
Yeah, well, social dialogue is, of course, the sharing of information, consultation, negotiation between employees and workers. These workers can be organized in trade unions, but there can also be other representative mechanisms. Core for social dialogue is, of course, the negotiation of collective bargaining agreements. And therefore, you need to have an organization to negotiate with. But another very important aspect of social dialogue is also the involvement of workers, the ownership and participation of workers in important aspects of sustainability and in the companies and workers' future in that way. So we have seen in other countries that workers can be involved actually in indicators, in the monitoring of indicators, in the implementation of indicators, so that it is a joint effort, which is far more sustainable. So, for instance, in Bolivia, I know an example that workers, together with the employers, are involved in the monitoring of the housing facilities for the workers in the cane cutting area. So, so that is also a form of social dialogue. And we feel that it's important to integrate this in this new standard so that it can be a structural part of how you implement these sustainability requirements.
Sounds good. So let's see if the audience will find it a lot clearer now how it's presented in the standard, and with the supporting guidance as well to explain what social dialogue is and how to use it with their workers in the employer-employee relations. It's great. Thank you, Marion. We had another question come in around water, so I'll hop back over to Peter. You were talking about the water requirements earlier, and the question is concretely whether water stewardship certification is now mandatory as part of the new version of the standard. And you're still muted, Peter.
So there is a core indicator for both mill and agriculture that the operator develops and implements a water stewardship plan. So this is core, and it's for both mill and agriculture. So that's the plan. So it involves identifying the main resources, the catchment areas, where the water resource is provided, and develop and implement an action plan to contribute to its sustainability and setting objectives for water stewardship. So they're the major parts of that water stewardship plan. So it should have achievable actions, agreed responsibilities, timeframes, and allocated resources. So for both, and I stress, it's for both mill and agriculture.
Great, thank you, Peter. That's very clear. Raoul, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can just add to that slightly. As in all of the standard requirements, when an indicator is written, it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be done wholly by the operator. If there are, for example, if this is already being undertaken by another body, for example, they have a local water management board, an irrigation board that already undertakes this. Or for example, the mapping, if mapping is available by a government agency and it provides it, doesn't mean that you necessarily need to do it. It just needs to be available and you need to have access to it. Yeah, just like that to all of the requirements in the standards.
Yeah, I certainly echo those comments. Thanks, Noel.
Yeah, that's great. Again, I guess the working group is really making an effort to make this as simple and as pragmatic as can be, while still having robust requirements for everyone to meet. So that is really encouraging to see. We had a few more very practical questions come in, and maybe I direct those to Nahuel as rep here from the Bonsucro Secretariat. So one is around the implementation period of the new standard. So let's start with that.
Yeah, so as whenever Bonsucro revises a standard, there's an implementation period, and the implementation period will vary. There's generally at the moment, we're targeting end of September for standard to be approved by our different governance board. Then after a month, it will be published. During this month period will be for translating, for the design, for clearing up any grammatical errors, for example. So once it's on the website, it's officially published, then the implementation period will take place. We haven't published yet the implementation timeline, but in previous standards, that implementation timeline has lasted, for example, from 1 year, where there's a different when it comes into force in different places, in different times. The first, for example, generally what would happen is the first 3 months, the standard is not active. This time it's done for the certification bodies to adapt their systems to be able to audit the Bonsucro new requirements, would be training the auditors, and then after these 3 months or so on, what we generally also do is provide first is those who are new certifications will have to be auditing first, allowing extra time for those who are already certified to adapt their system, adapt their processes in order to not lose their certification. So it could last, you know, in general, it could be more than a year until everyone has to be audited against the new standard.
Great, thanks, Nahuel. And another question to the Secretariat then. We're wondering what the extra cost of certification will be with the new standard.
Sure, so there are 3 different components to the cost of certification. The first one is the Bonsucro membership fee, which does not change, it still remains as it is. The second component is the auditing fee, which we don't expect or don't anticipate to change. Every negotiation around the auditing fee is a negotiation between the millers and their certification bodies. So then that would rest upon that commercial decision. And the third aspect of the cost of certification is, of course, the implementation of the standard. And that will depend on each operator on what are the current gaps and what they need to bring. But we see that more as an investment than as a cost.
Sounds good. And seeing as you just started talking about the audit costs, there's a specific question on that as well. People want to know whether in the audit that all the new revised core indicators, will they be verified during the audit, and how many months of records do they have to have for that to happen?
Yes, I don't know off the top of my head how many months of record needs to be verified. I can check and get back to you what it said in our new certification protocol, because alongside the development of all of the different Bonsucro standards is also the certification protocol and the auditing guidelines that are also being developed. So I'll need to understand that, what that means. So I'm afraid I don't have the answer now.
No, that's understandable, but you can get back on that one. Before we wrap up, there's also one more practical question around the agrochemicals. So maybe Peter, I can direct that one at you. The question is, are the banned agrochemicals subject to the country regulatory standards and approvals?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Obviously, you can only use agrochemicals that are registered in your country. On top of that, there is a list put out by the WHO and under a number of protocols, the Stockholm Protocol, the Montreal Protocol, etc., which are banned agrochemicals. They cannot be used full stop, no matter where you are and whether they are actually registered for use in your country. So if it's a banned agrochemical, it should not be used full stop.
Great, thank you for that clarification, Peter. That's basically the lot of questions that we had in. So if anyone has any final ones, please type them now. But in the meantime, maybe I'll just invite the panelists for some final remarks that you want to leave the audience with. And maybe now you'll go first on this one.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I think thanks is due to the working group who has spent a lot of, given up a lot of their time to really take in those extensive comments and to provide a different, to try and address them to the Bonsucro stakeholdership. I would like to invite everyone to read the standard, read the guidance, all of the documents that are available. I think a lot of the information is in the detail, and that's really what is important, is the detail. And to provide, let's see, clarification, feedback, or feedback on what is still unclear for the for the final draft, or what else you would like to see changed for the final draft. And so we'll, invite everyone to provide those comments to us. And thanks to the working group again.
Thanks, Noel. Marion, any final remarks from your side?
Well, just want to say thank you to everyone. It has been a joint effort, really impressive. And I think this standard is future-proof. It's in line with international developments on the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainability. And well, I think Bonsucro can be proud of it, and I hope that all the members can embrace these new standards and well, we'll take off positively. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Marion. And Peter, last but not least, any final remarks from your side?
Again, thank you very much for your input into developing these standards. I think one of the things that you certainly need to think about when you go away and look at them is the local legislative requirements and how you can actually use those to fulfill some of these criteria. I think that's very important to understand, that this is not necessarily an extra cost to the way that you do business. Thanks very much again, and we look forward to any comments that you have.
Great, thank you. Well, I'd like to really say thank you to the panelists who've joined us today to clarify the questions that we will have, and to share a little bit of the flavor of what it's like to be sitting in the working group as well, and give us a sense of the discussions and negotiations that went on there to lead to this revised draft that really reflects the working group's hard work and willingness to reach consensus and compromise on many of those points. So yes, I can echo what you all said and invite you to take a look at the new revised standard. And I believe we have one more slide just to share how you can actually give us some comments. So the standard is available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and you can find it on the Bonsucro website, where you can also find a link to an online survey that we developed. In that survey, it really takes you through the entire standard, also has space for you to provide some general feedback, answer some specific questions that the working group is particularly keen on getting input on. And you have time to do that until the 13th of July. So we hope you can share with your colleagues and also encourage them to provide input. If you have any questions, Noel has kindly made himself available, and you have his email address there on screen. And also, if you have colleagues who couldn't join today, or colleagues who speak Spanish or Portuguese, there's still a couple more webinars coming this week, but all of them will be recorded and also available on the website. So with that, thank you from my side, and I'll hand back to Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Bilge. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Nawal, for your contribution. I hope the attendees and you have all understood or seen or felt first the level of deep knowledge and passion that the panelists have expressed, and the working group members have shown into the lengthy work that is carrying out. And I think we can only thank them a lot for their contribution to, and to quote Marion, I think I concur totally, a future-proof standard that has been deeply reflected, negotiated, and reached consensus by each working group members. So that is just a very important milestone for Bonsucro as an organization, and I think for the sector as well, driving and putting the sector ready for the next 5 to 10 years. So on this, I would like as well thank you, Bilge, and the team at Proforest for supporting us along that process, lengthy, long, complex, but at the end, very successful process. And I invite each of you to visit our website. So the link is here on the screen, so you can download all the documents available, meaning the draft standards with Annex 2, which is the draft guidance, the summary of changes, or a detailed analysis of what was said in the first consultation, how the working group have taken the comment into account and come to the conclusion of draft 2, as well as the links to the survey that will be updated very shortly on our website. So you can already start working on it. And I recommend that you read carefully the instruction to the survey. The system is done, so you can start, pause, come back later, but there's instruction to follow to allow that. So you can take the time until the 13th of July to complete your survey. And as we mentioned, all your comments will be very useful for us to finalize these standards. So once again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or evening or this morning. And I wish you a good end of day and to speak to you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.